Good morning. My name is Brian Camey with Risk Management Professionals. Today I will be going over the topic of common deficiencies associated with CalARP, RMP, and PSM facilities. Let's get started. This slide is a brief summary of all of RMP's services. Our core competencies and expertise reside in EPA RMP, OSHA PSM, CalARP, and SEMS program development. Additionally, HAZOP and LOPA studies and other hazard identification techniques, and a variety of other process safety and regulatory standards. Today I will go over the program 3 elements for all prevention programs. I'll go over the periodic requirements and when program elements need to be updated. I'll go over common program deficiencies for each program element and a summary of everything I will go over today. Let's begin with the program 3 element overlap. This table highlights the regulatory requirements for the two federal level prevention programs, the US EPA RMP and OSHA PSM, and the two state-level prevention programs, CalARP and CalOSHA PSM. It is important to note that there is a significant amount of overlap between programs, meaning the deficiencies I will highlight today apply to all prevention programs. This presentation will highlight program level 3 elements. However, this information will cover facilities that are program 1 and 2 as well. Now let's go over the periodic requirements as part of the prevention programs. It is important to go over the periodic requirements to ensure that your prevention program is following regulatory guidelines. As changes occur in your facility's process, it is important that your program reflects these changes. Annual reviews of operating procedures must be performed to ensure that they accurately reflect what operators are expected to do, and the emergency plan must be reviewed to ensure procedures during an emergency are clear and up to date. You should ensure that this documentation of reviews are kept on file and includes when they are performed and by whom. Additionally, every 3 years it is required to ensure refresher training is performed to ensure personnel are adequately trained, and a compliance audit is required to ensure program element requirements are properly being performed and documented. Finally, every 5 years, the submittal, hazard assessment, process hazard analysis, and seismic assessment must be performed to ensure that the hazards within a process are routinely analyzed to ensure the safety of personnel is maintained. Now let's go over the common program deficiencies found within each program element. Here is a list of all the program elements. I will be going over each one in more detail, so let's begin with common deficiencies associated with the CalARP and RMP submittal. The CalARP RMP submittal is a description of the overall program that is submitted to the CalARP or EPA to ensure proper implementation of the risk management program. Some deficiencies that we have seen include performing this submission past the 3-year update window or submitting it incomplete. This can include a management system not being properly implemented by not being shown on the submittal, not being up to date, and not including an organizational chart with responsibility. It is important to ensure that when ownership is changed or any contact information within a program is changed, the submittal is updated to properly reflect this. However, it is important to note this does not reset the 5-year cycle, so ensure that the correct date of submittal is tracked. Finally, information regarding new accident history and emergency contact information must be updated to ensure proper regulatory requirements are met. A hazard assessment is performed to identify the worst case scenario of your process and identify the sensitive receptors that are affected by this type of release. Additionally, an alternative release scenario is selected to identify a release due to a more likely scenario to occur than the worst. Some deficiencies would include that the alternative release scenario is not properly described in detail on documentation. It's also important for the selected scenario to be more likely than the worst case, to follow guidelines for selected scenario releases, and should consider both the PHA and accident history when selecting this scenario. Additionally, these selected scenarios may not meet requirements and regulations. Finally, it is important to perform the revalidation studies once updated population census data is available and when your sensitive receptors and maps are updated to ensure that the effects of these hazards are accurately reflected with this new information. A large deficiency found in process safety information is with the piping and instrumentation drawings. Common deficiencies include missing parts of the overall diagrams, not including changes in the process or system of these drawings, and having operations personnel review these drawings during a PHA and noting that these do not actually reflect what's in there in the field. This is a large issue as the PHA's primary goal is to identify hazards associated with the current system or the proposed design changes. So if during the study they are in fact making red lines and changes to your drawings, it's not as effective as it should be. Additionally, there may be a lack of documentation found within the following information, like the pressure relief valve design basis, documents associated with the compliance of RAGA-gap, electrical area classification, any type of chemical reactivity hazards that are found in operating procedures, and finally, codes and standards that are used during the design phase are all important as they need to be documented and up to date to properly be able to analyze the hazards associated with the process. During a PHA, the amount of time spent during a session should be used effectively as there's a high level of knowledge in the room. To ensure this, it is important that a proper facilitator is selected with high knowledge of the system, design, and PHA methodology to get the most out of your study. It is also important to ensure that the hazard identification process includes the current codes associated with the system, that recommendations are included to improve safety deficiencies to meet these codes, that emergency shutoff locations are actually reflective of what is in the field, that key controls are properly documented and identified, and that the location of your pressure relief valves in the field are identified to ensure that they don't relieve in maybe high traffic areas or in areas that can provide or to include hazards to your operations personnel. It is also important to ensure that there is a mechanism in place to ensure that the 5-year deadline is not missed and that all checklists are performed during the study, such as your human factors, facility sightings, or external events. Additionally, it is important to ensure that all recommendations are closed in a timely manner. This timeline should either be developed with your AA within 2.5 years of your PHA, or that any changes developed from a recommendation should be performed during the next turnaround. A common deficiency with the closure of recommendations is that the documentation is not kept for the life of the process, and the completion dates are not documented. This is important to ensure that all recommendations are being tracked and closed out in the agreed timeline. It is also important to ensure that unnecessary revalidations are performed consecutively when only one is permitted between new PHAs. It is important for facility sightings to include up-to-date design codes and standards to ensure that all the hazards that you're looking at are accurately being analyzed. And finally, it is important that all scenarios are analyzed on a consistent basis to ensure that hazards are not being over or underlooked as the PHA study progresses. Common deficiencies associated with operating procedures are that they are not up to date, that they are not aligned with what operators are required to do, that they are not accurately described in the emergency scenarios, and that they do not have all your modes and phases of operations proceduralized, whether that's in your temporary phases or your abnormal phases, that these are all documented in your operating procedures. It is important for an acceptable alarm set point to be the ranges specifically to be documented and for the language to be clear and in the language of the user so that all operators are able to safely perform their required actions. It's also important that all consequences of deviation are included so that the operators are made aware of what can happen in the event of a deviation of their normal operation. And some tips to improve upon this would be to ensure that there may be sign-off sheets that are included once the procedures are reviewed, that personnel sit with operations to ensure that the procedures that they have on paper are accurate with what their intended actions are, and finally that emergency procedures are easily accessible during the event where time is limited and we need to gain access to this documentation. Training deficiencies would include the absence of documentation of completed training, the absence of training on maintenance procedures specifically, that there's records of proof of training, but however, the analysis on the actual understanding of the training may not be there, and finally, that the language in the training may not be familiar for the operators, leading to improper knowledge on training subject matter. So some tips that we'd like to talk about would be to include a written or oral quiz and maybe field observation being performed to ensure that all training material is clearly understood by personnel. Some deficiencies to note with the mechanical integrity program is that the written procedures for tasks are not available, completed, or even implemented. The maintenance activities are also not properly documented, and this can lead to issues associated with the frequency of maintenance not really aligning with industry standards. There is the improper development of the maintenance program, which can lead to key maintenance practices being overlooked or in general not looked at. And this can include pipe corrosion, issues with piping supports, and even for some facilities in lower temperature areas, there could be the issue that's not looked at for defrosting. It is also important that equipment deficiencies are put as a top priority on a work order list to ensure that they are addressed quickly and in a safe manner. And it is also important that any contractor involvement in maintenance schedule is documented so that it is properly tracked and any action items that are developed out of this type of maintenance are in fact fulfilled. So some tips to improve upon this would be to ensure that there is quality assurance performed. So specifically looking at your maintenance program and ensuring that all of the tasks are accurately described and that any type of follow-up information is documented and their closures as well is documented. And finally, I would say that all data to be pulled from your manufacturers or your suppliers is gathered and integrated in this program so that way that the overall intended lifespan of your equipment is actually reached. Some deficiencies with management of change would include that established procedures are not adhered to, and this can lead to gaps in changes in documentation and personnel not being properly notified to any of these changes that could potentially introduce new hazards. MOC procedures must be performed prior to startup to ensure that all PSI and operating procedures are properly updated so that any new hazards or all hazards in general are analyzed and that the proper steps are in place to protect your personnel. So some tips to ensure your MOC procedures are meeting regulatory requirements would be to ensure that they consider the technical basis for proposed change, they look at the impact of change on safety and health, their operating procedures are identified and documented, the time period for changes in timeline are established, and finally, proper authorization is included via signing these documentation forms. You should have a member of personnel reviewing these management of change forms and ensuring that all aspects are looked at. So pre-startup safety review, also known as PSSR, deficiencies are almost identical to those associated with the management of change process, the MOC process, as this review's purpose is to ultimately ensure that all potential new hazards for changes are analyzed and that all documentation is updated prior to your startup. However, it is important to ensure that these procedures are both individually performed to adhere to regulatory requirements. So some tips to ensure that your PSSR procedures are meeting regulatory requirements would be to ensure that your construction or all equipment is in accordance with your design specs, all procedures are in place, your PHA is completed if that is required, and that the recommendations associated with this are closed, and finally that any type of required training that may be required is completed, there's documentation, and that is reviewed to ensure that your personnel are adequately trained on any changes. Common deficiencies associated with the compliance audit would be that it is not performed within its 3-year window, the recommendations are not closed within a proper timeline, and that the overall final report does not properly document the scope of your audit, the methodology that's used in your audit, and the overall findings of your audits, any types of deficiencies identified with program elements. So it's important that all completion dates for recommendations are documented and tracked to ensure that any findings are properly addressed to ensure that your regulatory requirements are met. The overall goal of this compliance audit is to identify deficiencies and regulatory requirements that are not met. So any type of recommendations that are drawn from your compliance audit should be closed in a timely manner to ensure compliance. So common deficiencies associated with incident investigation would include recommendations from investigations not properly being addressed within your agreed upon timeline, your findings not shared with affected personnel, and that the investigation is not initiated within 48 hours of the incident, which is according to regulatory requirements. It is important that all required information from the investigation is properly documented, including the overall completion date of your recommendations. And finally, it is important to ensure that investigations are performed not only for incidents, but for near misses, as this could have had the potential for an incident, and proper investigation should be performed on your near misses because this can prevent an incident from occurring in the future. So some deficiencies that we'd like to include for our employee participation is that a written plan is not documented and shared with personnel, and that they are not made aware of where the overall program material is kept. So additionally, it is important that personnel are directly involved in the overall development of the program to ensure that it correctly reflects the system and that it is understandable to all personnel involved. Hot work permit. So some common deficiencies associated with the hot work permit is that personnel are not properly trained on the procedures associated with filling out these forms. The final permit forms are not properly documented, and that the overall field area is not verified by a supervisor prior to any hot work performed. Again, some tips in preventing these types of deficiencies would include proper training with personnel, any type of personnel that's involved in this hot work process, to ensure that it's properly looked at, there's proper training involved in how to fill it out, and that there's a final supervisor that is able to verify that this area is well prepared for hot work to be performed. Deficiencies associated with contractors would include the lack of documentation on training or procedures provided to your contractors. It's the lack of overall safety training given to contractors and the lack of periodic evaluation of your contractor work. So it's important that to develop these elements to ensure that contractors are not only being trained properly in the initial training, but refresher training as well as overall periodic evaluations to ensure that the quality that you demand is being met. Some deficiencies associated with emergency planning and response would include the overall selection of the correct type of emergency plan, whether that is if your facility requires a response plan or simply just an action plan. So it is important to understand the difference between the two, what is the correct plan for your specific facility, and what is required to meet these standards, whether you are a response plan or if you are an action plan. It is important to ensure that all contact information is up to date to ensure that in the event of an injury, the proper personnel can be reached. So annual review of this emergency response plan is also important to ensure that all involved members are aware of any changes and feel that the plan meets all requirements and ensures the safety of personnel. Finally, it is important for training to be well documented along with coordination with local agencies to develop that strong relationship that will show effect in the event of an emergency. A final deficiency I want to note is the lack of written procedures for the following items. It's important to ensure that there are proper procedures on how to interface with the public and local responders to ensure that all parties are correctly informed when a release occurs. Overall documentation on proper first aid and emergency medical treatment will ensure that all personnel can perform the necessary tasks in the event where, treatment may be needed. Procedures are required to be in place to properly handle a chemical release, and the actual emergency equipment must have procedures on how to inspect and how to maintain them to ensure that they function properly during the event of an emergency. And finally, the individuals responsible to be involved in the ICS must have proper training and documentation in place to ensure that it is routinely performed and that in the event of emergency, everyone is aware of their tasks at hand. So a reoccurring deficiency throughout a majority of these program elements is the recommendations that come out of them and how they're managed. So it is advised to assign an overall CalR PSM RMP coordinator to manage these recommendations. So this individual should be trained to understand the proper procedures associated with documenting, maintaining, and completing recommendations. This individual should ensure that all recommendations have a completion date that is coordinated with an AA and is verified to ensure that they're following regulatory requirements. Finally, these recommendations should be labeled closed when done, and that they should ensure that the completion date and any actions that are associated with these changes to the process are attached. So that way that in a paper trail, you're looking at how this recommendation was completed, what were the outcomes, is training involved, all of those aspects are verified and checked and kept together to ensure that from start to finish, following a closure, any types of action items have been closed as well. Now let's summarize what I went over. To summarize these common deficiencies, it is important for facilities to understand that program elements are on different cycles, whether that's annual, triannual, or every 5 years, and they must be reviewed and updated accordingly. It is important that these deadlines are met to retain compliance and that all recommendations are addressed and properly closed out. It is important that all procedures are updated and reviewed to ensure that they correctly reflect the system and that proper training is performed to ensure all members of personnel are made aware of any new hazards, existing hazards, and the tasks at hand. Finally, it is important that any changes to the system are addressed and proper procedures such as your MOC and PSSR forms are taken to update the PSI and ensure that all new potential hazards are identified prior to your startup. Thank you all very much for listening. If you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to me via email, and I'll be happy to get back to you.